Yokwe, Ali'i, Pakalofalayatu, Ta'alofalama, and welcome to the first SPRED webinar for 2021, hosted by your Climate Change Resilience Program with the theme, Move from Promise to Action. Before we proceed with today's agenda, the Pacific Way always starts with a prayer. May I now call on Reverend Semi to please say a short prayer to bless our webinar this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. May I speak in future, bless this session. Let us pray. Jobana tumeke mami baru malan. Kita bisa tambah katu karena kata ini nak kuat orang roh. Kita negara di kemdi, kita dibawa dari kemdi. Kita dikelan kondisatiku, kau dibanding teknik, kau nak balaku. Karena lo menunggu kita negara bikin institusi spread, negara bikin anak lu sama pun cuma baru nak bikin ni. Ada kita bisa apa tu nama ni Pasifik, macam negara bilik tadi. Nanti pun cuma dalam di lalu anak lu, yang nabi terai, yang nabi bandit tadi. Kalau fikir mami boleh, kita nanti di lalu aku pun bisa membuat mata fikir anak lu. Sama lagi nak kami tali nak kuasa nak politik bikin ni, aku nak punggu. Politik itu mah kira-kira tadi kita satu bukan masuk. Everyone says Amen.
Binaka Bakalevu, thank you very much, Semi, for blessing our webinar this afternoon. I now invite the Director General of SPRED to deliver his introductory remarks. Thank you. Director General, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Moderator. Yakwe, alofa, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Your Excellency, the Honorable David Kabua, the President of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. May I also acknowledge Senator Hilda Heine from the Parliament of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and also Ambassador Futuri and other excellencies who are joining us online. I'd like to acknowledge all of you. Esteemed representatives from Pacific Island countries here in the region and abroad, esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this first SPRED webinar series on the theme Move from Promise to Action, which has been organized by our Climate Change Resilience Program. Many of you are aware that our leaders here in the Pacific have consistently said that climate change is the most critical and serious threat to the survival, livelihoods, and sustainable development of the Pacific. Recent scientific analysis of the impact of existing and new nationally determined contributions compared to the emissions gap, and that is the difference between where we are heading versus where we need to be to stay below the 1.5 degrees target, shows that even after the announcements at the US President's Climate Change Summit by key countries such as China and also the European Union and others, the gap has only been shown to be narrowed by only 11 to 14%. What this tells us is that there's a lot more work that needs to be done for us to close the gap. Collectively, we know from the information that we have that we need a reduction of 20 to 30 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions in order for us to stay on target. We also know from recent science that tell us that globally, we are on track for 2.4 degrees of warming. And an optimistic scenario would indicate a 2-degree warming if all net zero targets are met and implemented. We have heard from the International Energy Agency report that state subsidies towards fossil fuel supply, including new unabated coal plants, new oil and gas fields, and the new coal mines have now been halted. This is, of course, good news for all of us. But there's also a big ramp up of solar and wind capacity and also a coal phase out in many of the advanced economies. All of these actions point to a positive development, and it is very heartening for all of us. However, we all know that that is not enough. We need to do more. We need to be ambitious in our actions. So what does that mean for the Pacific? As a region, we've already submitted our ambitious nationally determined contributions, and even several of us have submitted upwardly revised NDCs in recent months. Together, as a region, we remain steadfast in advocating for equitable, ambitious, and evidence-based NDCs. The recent US-hosted climate summit provided valuable impetus to raising ambition, and many major emitters have pledged to increase mitigation efforts. I would therefore like to commend His Excellency President David Kabua for being the voice of the Pacific in this very important forum. And I might add that while it is heartening to hear these major announcements being made, what we want to see is a translation of these announcements to concrete action. Finally, I would like to thank our esteemed and knowledgeable panelists for agreeing to share their experiences and expertise with all of us today. We appreciate that you all have busy schedules, but appreciate the fact that you have availed yourselves so that we can participate and that we can all join in this dialogue. Thank you very much once again, and welcome to this dialogue Move from Promise to Action. And I now have the honor of introducing His Excellency, the Honorable David Kabua, President of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, to present his keynote address. I'd like to just remind us that the address is in the form of a video. So it's pre-recorded our message, and we appreciate the fact that His Excellency was able to avail himself to do this for us. So thank you very much once again, President Kabua.
Yahweh, it is my great pleasure to be joining this webinar on moving from promise to actions. There is no better time for us to be talking about the need to move from promises to action. We in the Pacific know the urgency of the situation. We have always been leaders on climate change because of the threat it poses on our lands and oceans, our people, and our culture. I was honored to attend the recent Climate Leaders Summit hosted by President Biden on behalf of this region, vulnerable countries, and the High Ambition Coalition. And I was heartened by the signals that emerged from that summit. The UK and US, for example, announced strong new targets, and all members of the G7 are now committed to net zero. We are seeing a growing recognition around the importance of adaptation, which has lacked the attention it deserves for too long. And just last week, the G7 announced its decision to halt overseas coal financing. These are crucial steps in the right direction, but we need to be making strides, not steps. Despite the signals of progress, action to address this existential threat is still far from where it needs to be. Far too few countries have submitted enhanced NDCs. Fewer still have long-term strategies in place, and even fewer national adaptation plans. National adaptation plans are the basis for meeting the commitments made internationally, including the 1.5 future on which our safety depends. We in the Pacific have been leading the way. The rest of the world must follow. Finance is, of course, crucial. The 100 billion climate finance commitment is a promise that must be met. Certainly, the developed world's economies have been hit hard by the COVID-19 crisis, but so have those in the developing world, and in many cases, the economic hits are compounded by the debt crisis developing states face. And even as many parts of the developed world are hearing the engines of their economies beginning to rev up, the developing world risks being left behind as unequal vaccine distribution limits recovery and forces us to keep protections in place for our people's health. A resilient recovery from this crisis requires ambitious climate action, equitable vaccine distribution, and for all states, developed and developing, to put their money into initiatives that reduce emission and preserve our future. And there is an important opportunity for change to happen swiftly in each sector by implementing policies and technical approaches that can get us to net zero. An important example of this is the global shipping industry. We know just how important shipping is for our economies. Many of our countries lie at a great distance from the goods we need to survive. But this is also one of the world's most polluting sectors. The recent call from the US to achieve net zero shipping emission by 2050 is something that we have been championing for many years. And it's high time that the IMO's greenhouse gas reduction strategy reflects that goal. Putting a price on emission is a vital way to achieve net zero in the industry. We have collaborated with our friends in the Solomon Islands to introduce a carbon levy for maritime shipping, which we hope our other Pacific neighbors can support at the IMO this June. This levy would create certainty in the market, incentivizing investment in emission-reducing technology, and keep clean technology a way to compete with high-polluting fossil fuels in use today. A major portion of the levy's revenue would also go towards helping countries like ours with our climate mitigation and adaptation goals. Finally, as those of us on the front lines know, because we can see it in rising tides, growing storm, and the spread of diseases, now is the time that we must focus on adaptation and preparing for the impacts of the climate crisis. In the Marshall Islands, we are working on our national adaptation plan, reaching out across our many islands to understand the adaptation needs of our people and the future they want to see. Again, our region can lead the way, developing inclusive, ambitious adaptation plans that merge the best available science with the traditional knowledge of our people, and advocating for adaptation to receive the attention it deserves internationally and the finance it needs to deliver. I look forward to working with you all as we continue to collaborate towards a greener, safer, and more resilient future. Kumol Dada, and I wish you all a successful meeting.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency President David Kambo, for your remarks. We, of course, want to acknowledge and thank you for the leadership in representing the Pacific region in the recent US hosted Climate Action Summit. We appreciate the fact that amplified and became the voice of the Pacific in that very important leaders summit. So thank you very much for those remarks.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes the official opening of our webinar this afternoon. May I now invite our moderator for our panel session. He is someone who's well known to all of us in the Pacific region, a gentleman who has worked tirelessly for the benefit of our Pacific people. I'd like to invite back the Director General of SPRED, Mr. Kosi Latu, to commence our panel session. After.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin in earnest our webinar this afternoon by setting the scene. And I'd like to do this by just outlining the key objectives of the webinar. And if you're looking at the screen, you'll see that it's already outlined there. But I'd like to just quickly move through these because this is very important in terms of the context in which this webinar is being held. So as you know, the title of this webinar is Moving from Promise to Action, but it's about empowering that movement for us here in the Pacific in terms of Pacific Island countries. And for us, the message is one of survival. For us, the Paris Agreement, of course, is the litmus test in terms of the action that is needed in terms of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees, to 1.5. We also will be focusing in this webinar in terms of looking at decarbonization efforts that are being undertaken across the Pacific region, which aim to meet the 1.5 global warming goal and lessons learned along this journey. So we will be hearing from a number of panelists in terms of what is being done in the region. The other important objective of this webinar is the fact that we are, of course, focusing on 1.5 and the emphasis to encourage everybody to flex for 1.5 as the world moves from promise to action, by reiterating why we need to be ambitious and aim for ambitious climate targets. Of course, the urgency behind this and why we are doing it and how we want to achieve these targets by way of a collective political will. The last key objective is, and we will hear more about this from our panelists, is the need for us to understand the different ways which international emission targets impact, of course, the whole world. But for us here in the region, it is very important for us to understand how this impacts us as a region. And so we will be going through that journey of decarbonization as a region that is facing the threats of survival. So those are the objectives of this very important webinar. And I'd like to get right into our first panel for this afternoon. This panel is for about 40 minutes. We have 3 panelists, and I will be introducing them one by one before we start. Each panelist will be given 10 minutes to speak with follow-up questions by myself. And then we plan to have an additional 30 minutes for Q&A from participants. So I'd like to encourage you to use the Q&A function to post any questions that you would like to pose to the panelists. So I'd like to begin by introducing our first panelist. Our first panelist is Dr. Bill Hare. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Climate Analytics. I'd like to just say just a few words about his bio. Bill is a physicist and climate scientist. And as I mentioned, he's the CEO of nonprofit Science and Policy Institute for Climate Analytics. He has been described as the go-to climate advisor for most vulnerable countries in small island states and least developed countries. He has contributed immensely to leading reports, including the IPCC, the World Bank Turn Down the Heat report series, and he is one of the leaders in the Climate Action Tracker. So before we move on to the next speaker, perhaps maybe I'd like to ask Bill. Bill, I hope I've done justice to your bio. I know there's a lot more I can say, but is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
Thanks, Kossi. No, I think that's great. I'll be happy to just move into what I need to do. And it's great to see everyone and old friends. And I'm pretty can't be there in person in Samoa.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We will come back to you, Bill, in a moment, but let me introduce the rest of your panel and we'll come back to you. Our second panelist is Mr. Tuti Chilton. Our second speaker is the chair of the Pacific National Determined Contribution NDC Hub. He's also the executive director for the Palau Energy Administration and is the focal point for Palau's NDCs. He uses sports as a vehicle for development, especially in wrestling, archery, and sailing. So a very interesting bio. But Tuti, would you like to add something else to what I've said?
Director, nope, I think that says everything, and would like to be able to focus on the Pacific NCD Hub. Thank you very much and looking forward to the panel.
Thank you very much, Tuti. Last but not least, our third panelist is the Chief Executive Officer of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment here in Samoa. The Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment Samoa is the lead ministry in terms of sector coordination of the environment, including also the water sector. There's a lot more I could say about that, but in view of our time, let me just also add that the ministry is also responsible for climate change, renewable energy, water resource, forestry, land management, and environment conservation. I'd like to introduce and acknowledge Ms. Frances Brown-Ropena. Welcome to our panel, Frances. I know there's a lot more I could say about your bio, but would you like to add anything before we begin?
Thank you very much, Yamaniota. I believe that's sufficient enough for our purposes today. So I'm more than happy to also present what I'm supposed to present to this kind of discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay. I think our panelists are content with what I've said. Okay, well, listen, ladies and gentlemen, and I know the panelists sound like they're keen to get straight into it, so we're going to get right into our panel. And we're going to start with our first speaker, our first panelist, Dr. Bill Hare, and then we will work our way through. Each of the panelists have got 2 questions, and so we'll try and move through those 2 questions in a methodical way. So, Bill, I feel intimidated asking a well-known climate change scientist any kind of questions, particularly yourself. But I have a script in front of me, so I'm bound to ask these questions. But let me begin by just asking this first question, Bill, and that is, what does the decarbonization in the Pacific entail in order for the Pacific region to continue to be leaders of the climate change fight?
Right. Well, I guess the bigger context, I think, is that what really matters is that we get emissions to 0 by 2050. Now, of course, in the Pacific, getting emissions to 0 won't matter for the global climate at all. It's such a small fraction of emissions. But the bigger story is that if we can get in the Pacific emissions to 0, it provides a very large demonstration effect to the larger emitters around us. And we know that historically that action by small island states has embarrassed and encouraged others to go further and faster. But also it's about development and about economic growth and employment. We know now that decarbonising our economies, big or small, will really lead to very significant economic opportunities and often to increased job outcomes and greater economic resilience. We're all suffering, Pacific Islands particularly, but many other smaller countries, from the shocks from the COVID-19 pandemic, and moving towards decarbonised economies in the Pacific means that you'll be reducing your fuel imports and relying more on locally produced energy and energy resources. So that's really produces a big benefit. Within the Pacific as well, as the President Marshall Islands indicated, building up resilience to the shocks that are going to happen, even if we are successful in limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, is going to be very, very fundamental. Now, I just wanted to say, Ossie, I think for me, one of the big stories going on this year, and I'm happy to come back to that in later questions, is actually the way in which the 1.5 degree limit has been mainstreamed. We're hearing that so often from leaders in the major economies now, that it's become one of the central calls, even in the recent G7 Environment Ministers meeting. And that's something that I think that that in the Pacific, you can really work with and really push big emitters to say, honor those commitments now you're making to 1.5 degrees. And as you referred to, the International Energy Agency report has shown very clearly that that we can't afford any new fossil fuel developments anywhere. They said that all new fossil fuel infrastructure developments need to stop very soon, in fact this year, if we're going to have a chance of getting to net zero. The last two messages are about why getting to net zero by 2050 is so important. We know that from the physics of the climate system that getting net zero means that very shortly afterwards, warming will halt. So getting to net zero by 2050 means that warming will halt close to 1.5 degrees. But we also know in the long run that sea level rise will not stop. And getting to net zero is really important to limit the ultimate long-term sea level rise risk, which is of course existential for many countries in the Pacific, and if not existential, then really threatens major problems for coastal infrastructure, agriculture, water supplies throughout the region. So back to you, Kossi.
Oh, thank you very much, Bill. We already have I think a couple of questions on the Q&A, but perhaps maybe we'll come back to that after the second question, Bill. But I think that's a good start to our session this afternoon. So can I then follow up with a second question? The question is, what else can the Pacific do now to guarantee survival tomorrow?
Really important question. There's quite a lot that the Pacific needs to do and has to do, I think, to guarantee its survival, even if we and we need to be successful in limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. But one of the most important is the rapid scaling up of adaptation measures and projects. These need to be designed very much from within the local context, and that needs to be linked very strongly to greater access to climate finance to pull off those adaptation projects. It's also important in order to develop fully climate resilience within the Pacific Island countries, is that this adaptation needs to be looking at the whole system, not just one individual issue, but to make sure that the adaptation measures and projects are linked to a whole system analysis. That is the whole economic impacts of climate change on different systems. So, and particularly in the region, there needs to be a really important focus on how to improve ecosystem resilience, because they're really fundamental to a wide range of issues and sustainability issues around the Pacific Islands. Now, of course, we also need to be clearly understanding that by the time you get to 1.5 degree warming, we know that important limits to adaptation will be reached or already crossed. So that we know that at 1.5 degree warming, which could only be a few decades away, even if we're successful globally in getting emissions to zero by 2050, that we're going to lose a lot of coral reef systems and many of the services that they provide. So it's very important to focus, for example, on also a range of coastal marine management approaches that maximize the resilience of our coral reefs and marine ecosystems so that they're able to survive in the best shape possible the warming that is to come. Now, I think also I would also like to include the mitigation area here as well. I think there is a coupling between adaptation and mitigation, so it's very important that in the Pacific context that keeps into focus as well. But just returning to the question then of how to guarantee this survival, there's a lot of know-how in the Pacific, but one of the big problems that we've seen for years is the lack of access to significant enough climate finance. And I think that's something that really needs to be focused on by Pacific Island leaders to make sure that the international community, Australia and New Zealand, really provide the resources needed for the region to adapt successfully.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that. I'm just wondering whether maybe we can take a couple of questions for this part of the session, and before we move on. So I'm just looking to see if any questions on the Q&A board. So maybe there aren't any questions right now, but we'll come back to that later. I'm assuming that some people are probably framing their questions around what you just said, Bill, so we'll come back to that. I'm told that there's a question just appeared on the Q&A board. So, Bill, sorry, perhaps maybe we can deal with this question now. Okay. All right, Bill, let me just try and read the question from where I'm sitting. The question is, before COP26, do Pacific Island countries expect Australia to set a new Paris target that will actually substantially reduce emissions? Did you get that?
Yes, I did. That's clear. I can also see the question in the chat as well. Thank you. Yeah, look, it's a good question. There's two ways to look at that. Do you expect the Australian government to actually adopt a new target or even to adopt a net zero goal by 2050? On the present political trajectory in Australia, no. Should Australia, I would turn that around and ask the question about whether Pacific Island countries should be trying to exert more diplomatic pressure on Australia to basically to step up its 2030 goals. It may not be obvious, you know, within the Pacific, but Australia is under enormous pressure from the United States, the European Union, and some of its other trading partners to really improve its 2030 goals. It's a very active political discussion here. The government is very defensive about its positioning, and everyone anticipates that more diplomatic pressure is going to be exerted by the US and EU particularly in the coming months. In addition, what is also very important to understand is that the European Union is moving towards adopting carbon border tax adjustments, which means that countries that are not acting sufficiently on climate change will have some or parts of their imports into those economies like the European Union subject to carbon taxes. That is something that is causing a great amount of angst in Australian economic circles, but it illustrates the kind of pressure that Australia needs to be under from the region broadly in order to improve its standing. And in addition to the question of the target, I think Australia and also New Zealand to a lesser extent should also be asked to really stump up on climate finance, really falling back, and I think that's really fundamental. So those twin needs for increased ambition from Australia on the mitigation front by 2030 and stepping up on climate finance are also consistent with the big top-level messages that the UN Secretary General Guterres is promoting globally for all countries. So would be well within the rights of the Pacific Island countries to contemplate further diplomatic pressure on Australia in order to play its fair and responsible role globally and in the region.
Thank you very much, Bill, for those insights and your comments. Appreciate that very much. We may come back later to you if we have time for further question, but I'd like to now move on to our next speaker. And I'd like to ask the following question to T. The first question to T is, which approach will work best given the finite resources and limited time that we have?
Thank you, Director General. Thank you for this time. I know we're limited on time, so I will be focusing more on the role of the NDC Hub and focusing on the 5 areas quickly. The first one is, and as you know, back in April, the Regional Pacific NDC Hub created a strategy 2030, and those are the 4 areas that we want to use to help work with individual Pacific Island nations to meet the NDC targets. We recognize that both the national and regional approach will work depending on the nation, and the NDC Hub works with them on individual projects as well as possibly bundling some of these works that are there. So these particular aims, number 1, from the strategy 2030 is improve NDC planning, policy, strategy, and legislation in Pacific Islands. Number 2, strengthening enabling environment for NDC implementation, accelerate NDC action on the ground through projects and programs implementation. And number 4, enhance NDC measurements, reporting, verification, and transparency actions. The Pacific NDC Hub believes that with these 4 strategies in place, it will definitely help look at and plan for the finite resources that we're talking about, as well as the limited time as we try to meet our individual NDC goals. The number 2 item that we want to identify is being able to leverage the limited public finance to crowd additional resources. And that's where those strategies come into play. We need to be able to show that each individual country and as a region in general can meet its obligations. And these are the evidence that we show that. We do recognize that the scale of investment is very small in the Pacific Islands, and this idea of bundling is very important. The example of the Pacific Island Renewable Energy Investment Program, where we had $17 million in grants from GCF that supported renewable energy investments in Cook Islands, RMI, FSM, Nauru, PNG in Samoa and Tonga. So that's the 3rd item that we like to think about. Number 4, which is always one of the issues we have in the Pacific, is this national capacity building, allowing to look for organizations, whether government, within our individual countries to be able to directly access climate finance and welcoming some of the trends and focus that are there. This way to be able to kind of cut down on some of the bureaucracy that we see as possible obstacles that we look at. And then finally, to deal with the energy security aspect of individual nations with this issue of COVID and not be able to travel, we need to start looking at building a blue economy. If you talk about the energy sector, then we're talking about specifically green energy, and as a way to build both the economy as well as give us energy security within individual island nations. So those are the five kind of major points. And just want to reiterate that it's not one or the other. It's not a national plan or regional plan, but we need a mix of both and be able to be flexible, because every island has their own unique issues and their own unique expectations, as well as connections through bilateral agreements or work that they do with other countries. So that's to answer your question specifically for number 3. And I'll turn it back over to you, Director General, and we'll look for the other questions that may come up. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Chief for that. We'll take a note of your response and the very useful comments that in response to the first question. But can we go to the second question and then perhaps maybe take a question or two? The second question is, our Pacific Islands need financial resources to achieve massive sectoral transformational change. How can this be achieved in these COVID-19 times?
Okay. We've always had, from the point of view of Pacific Island countries, we've always had obstacles being the fact that we're slightly isolated in the Pacific. So this COVID-19 time is nothing new. The only thing new about it now is we're not able to travel as frequently as we want it to be. But we cannot allow this pandemic to stop the momentum that has created the specific opportunity for green recovery through the investments in renewable energy. The region can create much more needed employment and income as a way to address not just the COVID-19 issue that we have now, but to also can address the issue of economy that was brought up earlier. Pacific Islands need to start looking at unpacking their NDC commitments through their roadmap investment plans to try to get the countries closer to better understanding the investment needs, finance, and resource. Just like Dr. Hare said earlier, the biggest obstacle we have is finance in getting these projects online. With the NDC Hub, we are very fortunate with our partners and our donors, specifically Triple GI, of course, SPREP, GIZ, and SPC. They are always there to give us our technical support. And through this medium of internet, we are able to continue to do the work, not face-to-face, but we're able to do the work through Zoom and other forums that are there. The final thing, last two things, is the Pacific Island countries. Like Dr. Hare said earlier, we need to start taking the driver's seat and driving the agenda. We did that with developing the Paris agreements and getting our NDCs. We did that by creating the NDC Hub in 2017, and we continue to do that now through the COVID-19 area that we have. Specifically looking at opportunities for grants, concessional and blending financing. We need to start looking at how we can fully exploit those ideas, especially this public partnership that we need to start looking at also. Again, yes, our scale is small, but there are some private entities that are willing to invest in our islands, especially in the blue economy / green energy aspects that are there. Now, one of the keys to realize in the decarbonization agenda is that we should not cut ourselves away or divorce ourselves away, but we should develop our national development agendas of the Pacific Islands to achieve renewable energy targets, not just for climate change, but also for energy security on our islands, as well as food security and water security. Those are some of the, Director General, those are some of the major points that the NDC Hub would like to focus on. specifically about how to achieve our goals through the COVID-19 times and continue on with this transformational change. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I turn it back to you again, Director General. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tuti, for that, and appreciate the perspectives, very useful perspectives that you provided on the two questions. I'm just trying to look at the board to see if there's any questions following on from your comments. All right, Tuti, we have one question. It's on the board. You can have a look at it. So the question is, renewable energy electricity generation does not necessarily mean cheaper electricity for Samoa. How are other Pacific Islands meeting their renewable energy targets and balancing affordability? Did you get that?
Yes, I see it right here on the question and answer sheet screen. Again, that is one of the toughest questions that is always being put out. How to balance or how to meet the renewable energy targets issue with climate change, specifically dealing with renewable energy technologies, whether solar, wind, hydro, or any other forms of technology that is out there. How do we balance affordability? I'm going to be like Dr. Hare and sort of turn the question around and not necessarily say, how do we balance affordability as a nation, but how do we develop energy security? What kind of projects can we put into place, not just from the power producer point of view, but from an individualized, possible off-grid kind of system that individuals can have access to? With this possible public-private partnership, we can get our governments through these possible grants to be able to bring in renewable energy that we can go ahead and use for individual homes and businesses. Specifically, a lot of the Pacific Island nations have a net metering program. And if we can get affordable solar rooftops on individual homes or communities, that will be able to lower down the cost of electricity for individual households. That is the one that's kind of working currently. I'm using Palau as an example, and maybe it can work in other countries. Again, each individual island has their own specific reasons why cost of electricity is high, and we need to be able to meet them directly and figure out how to blend technology and use for individual use, like a net metering system, versus having the power company producing for the whole nation. So I hope that answers the question directly, and I hope it's useful to the person asking the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tuti. I think what you've said certainly provided more clarity on, I think, the essence of the question. We'll come back to any later questions in relation to your part of the panel, but I'd like to now move on to our third speaker. I've already introduced Ms. Frances Brown Rapena. I'd like to give her the opportunity now to provide a response to the two questions. And Frances, the first one, and welcome again. The first question is, what does the decarbonization of the energy sector in Samoa, or in your country and the Pacific, entail to continue to be leaders of the climate change fight?
everyone. I would like to first of all thank Ms. Becky for organizing this webinar and inviting MNRE as part of the panel discussions, and I'm very happy to, of course, share the experiences in our fight to our contribution in relation to implementation of our mitigation strategies. So I'm happy to share that we have Samoa's updated its national climate change policy, which prioritizes both adaptation and mitigation strategies. We are at the moment in the process of finalizing our long-term strategy, our greenhouse gas abatement strategy 2020-2030, which identifies all other key sectors that we will need to enhance and to upscale the level of ambition in terms of our NDCs. Work is also currently underway to undertake our 2007 GHG inventory and develop our third national communication report to the UNFCCC. But I would like to note that Samoa, like other states, is doing its part in advocating and implementing climate actions. And this is demonstrated through our current NDC target of generating 100% of our electricity from renewable energy sources by 2025. So approximately 50% of generated electricity is produced from 4 renewable energy sources, namely wind, solar, hydro, and of course our newly launched biomass gasification plant. So we are currently working on finalizing our enhanced NDCs, as noted earlier, for the second round of NDC submissions for the COP26 this year. We are targeting more sectors, such as the transport sector, tourism, forestry sector, including bamboo and seagrass fields. There are also other initiatives that we've undertaken as part of our mitigation actions, and one of them being the implementation of the 2 million tree planting campaign. And this was running from 2015 to 2020. And I'm very pleased to note that we have exceeded the 2 million target, and we've planted to date 2.3 million trees. So at the moment, we are finalizing the report, validating, of course, the campaign, the results of the campaign for the 5 years from 2015 to 2020. But we are also looking at piloting, looking at carbon trading. At this point in time, we are undertaking a pilot payment for ecosystem services. And this will target forest conservation, and we're looking at piloting 2 areas. So one of them, a community-based payment for system service project, and the other one involving a private landowner. So it's very much a pilot for us at this point in time, but we are looking forward to the result of this pilot in 2 weeks' time, and see whether this is something that we can look into in terms of conserving our forests, and at the same time, as a source of livelihood to our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis, and interesting to hear some of the activities that are being done on the ground in Samoa. But can I follow up with the second question? The second question is, which approach will work best given the finite resources and the limited time we have?
Well, in my experience, there is no one approach that will fit. I think every other approach that we have to come up with has to be contextualized and in line with the realities on the ground. So I have more than 10 years of experience as a coordinator in the environment sector and the water and sanitation sector. And part of the government sector planning reform saw the establishment of key sectors, development sectors, to facilitate or to coordinate the implementation or the achievement of the national goals, and one of them involving energy. And I find, in my experience, that what was most significant about the sector-wide approach it was that it created a platform. It allowed us to pull in multi-stakeholders, not only within governments, but beyond government, and we look at the involvement of our of the private sector, the involvement of our civil society groups as part of the planning, as part of the implementation, and as part of the monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. So this has been very useful in my view, and based on my experience, because it has created useful networks and partnerships between government agencies, and of course within government agencies, but as well pulling in and ensuring that we have the trust as well of our stakeholders from outside government. We are seeing this, and the advantages of being able to liaise very closely with our stakeholders cannot be emphasized enough based on my experience. So it has also allowed us to optimize the use of limited resources, financial and technical. And it also allowed other ministries to tap into the support or the technical expertise of other local ministries to help us in delivering some of our key targets. And this is all under the umbrella of agreed national goals. Stakeholders, and I think in my experience, stakeholders over time have developed this trust and understanding of areas of mutual trust, but as well a healthy understanding between each other, because we don't always agree in certain areas, but having that healthy partnership between our stakeholders has helped us a lot. Meaningful partnerships, and in a way it is also very much like establishing communities of practice, when we have different stakeholders coming together, sharing information, sharing lessons learned, not only within the sector but across the sector. So if I were to recommend, and based on my experience, what would be a useful approach for people or for other countries to take into account, it would be the sector-wide approach to planning, coordination, implementation, monitoring, and reporting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those wise words. Appreciate those comments. We'll now go to Q&A once again. We'll just take questions at this stage for Francis, and then we'll go back and have a look at some of the other questions that we weren't able to address earlier on. So we'll check the board, Q&A board, and see if there's any specific question on this component of the panel. All right. While we're waiting for questions for the panel, there are a couple of other questions that are on the Q&A, so maybe we can have a look at them. There is one. I think it's a general question on climate financing, and maybe all of the panelists can have a stab at this one. The question is, climate financing, how can climate financing, how can it be best addressed? How can we address it given the experience to date? Region versus national, program versus projects through budget support. I hope I've asked the question in the correct way. So climate financing, how can it be best addressed given the experience to date, region versus national, program versus project through budget support? So maybe this is, it sounds like a general question, although it is climate financing, but perhaps maybe I can open it up to all the panelists. Bill, maybe would you like to have a go at this first, and then maybe we ask the other panelists as well for their comments?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kossi. Look, a quick comment, I think, is that there's obviously a fair bit of experience now in the Pacific with climate finance at national and in some cases involving several different countries. But it's also true that the very diverse circumstances in the Pacific make regional projects, I think, kind of very difficult to get going. But I'm not on the ground. It's just an observation, I guess, helping over the years. So I think I should hand back to colleagues on the ground, actually, for more elaboration or correction to what I've just said.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Bill. Maybe I'll pass it on to Tuti. Maybe you have a go at this one, and maybe Francis as well.
Sure. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Director General. I think the question is, again, like earlier, it's both. There are some projects that we can do regionally that we can bundle in terms of finance. But more importantly, there are projects that need to be done on land, on each individual island rather than just focusing on programs. We need to do both for developing human capacity to be able to maintain and work with. And this is the wonderful thing about the Regional Pacific NDC Hub. It's in a position where it can do both, a regional focus project program that addresses projects on each individual islands. And I think we've shown that now with how they approach it in the context of how the individual islands meet the NDC Hub, NDC targets. So it is a program. We need to meet our climate change targets, and yet they work individually to help each individual islands to do that using projects, whether renewable energy or any other energy efficiency ideas that are there. So I look towards the NDC Hub for that particular focus. Back to you, Director General. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tuti. I'm going to ask Francis to perhaps maybe also give a response. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide also a little bit of my experience with sector budget support. Around my time as the coordinator of the water and sanitation sector, we had made the transition to sector budget support, and this was fully funded by the European Union. And my experience with sector budget support is that it very much strengthened or enhanced the sector-wide approach to planning, and that we were able to identify programs, not discrete project approaches, as the traditional approach is, but looking at programmatic approaches and then using that program to leverage for funding. And so under the water and sanitation sector, we've developed sector-wide programs that were then funded predominantly by the European Union through sector budget support. So there were no, in my experience, it was the way to go in terms of flexibility that it afforded countries in terms of implementation. So there would be, for example, 1 year where we would have, for example, up to 25 million tana a year to spend based on the program that we had already agreed on. So there was a lot of flexibility in terms of implementation, which my experience is under the discrete project approaches is very much, it's not flexible. There's a lot of back and forth between countries and the donors, but with sector budget support, it afforded us a lot of flexibility as long as we were hitting agreed targets or performance targets between the country and the partner, development partner, in this case, the European Union. I believe, in my experience and in my view, it's very successful. And up until now, we are still continuing the sector budget support on the water and sanitation sector. So it promotes programmatic approach, which is a more strategic direction in terms of implementing programs, and it facilitates as well a wider coordination of a multitude of partners to come together to deliver on this agreed program. And it has worked well, and it continues to work well for the water and sanitation sector.
Thank you very much, Francis. Again, very wise words. It's good to hear that there are things that are actually happening and are happening well, being done well on the ground. We have a couple of questions on the board. So I'm looking at it. There's a mixture of specific ones for individual panelists, and there's probably one or two general ones. And perhaps maybe if we could deal with the open one or the more general one, and then we'll address the specific ones to the panels after that. Okay, you should be able to see it on your screen. This general one is to do with South-South cooperation. The question is, South-South cooperation, is this approach useful, and can it be strengthened given the limited resources and finance? So if the panelists could just have a stab at that one as well, and then we'll go to the specific ones. Bill, would you like to have a go at this, and maybe to
look, I think South-South cooperation is something that's really growing all over the world. Certainly, in some of the other regions that we work, particularly with least developed countries in Africa and also in South Asia, South-South cooperation is really exploding, and that reflects lots of different factors. So I would say yes, of course, of course, with any sort of cooperation, you need to make sure that you're getting what you need, not just what the donor wants. That's the same generic issues apply as with North-South cooperation, that sometimes the donors want to do something that you don't really need or isn't the best thing to do, or that contradicts national priorities. So that's a generic issue that won't go away, and it's a normal problem to deal with. But I think it's great to really improve that. And also what you're seeing is a lot of the larger southern countries, if I can put it that way, are also becoming relatively wealthy and also getting in the position to provide climate finance, conditional loans, and so on and so forth, with all of the problems that we saw from the northern facilities in the past. This is not going to go away either, but it's all to be welcomed and developed, I think.
Would you like to have a go at this?
Yes, thank you very much, Director General. Yes, I agree with Dr. Hare. It is very useful. Again, I'm just pointing to the experience with the Pacific Regional NDC Hub. I think that's for us currently is the best place to start with. Be able to leverage the experience that we're having now since 2017. Be able to show that we could actually get the work done that we say we get done, and then make the connections. We always make a comment earlier about how the NDC Hub can be almost a one-stop shop kind of mentality, where any Pacific Island country or territory can come in and get the services that is needed in the context of whether the NDC or, as we look towards the future, whatever need that might come up in the Pacific Island countries and territories, based on, of course, our leadership and what they want from there. So yes, we both agree. It's a very important way to be able to ensure our cooperation, as well as our continued relationships, as well as finding new creative ways to be able to address our own collective as well as individual issues with climate change. Thank you.
Francis, any comments, Rocco?
I don't have anything new to add on top of what's been mentioned already. I do agree that I think that it's very important that priorities are national priorities and that our donors are responsive to those national priorities. I don't have anything to add to that.
Thank you very much once again to our panelists for those useful insights. Looks like there's another general question that's just come up on our Q&A board. The question is, this is about climate information management. The pandemic has seen an increase in the spread of online misinformation, which often includes climate-related falsehoods. Is this considered a risk factor in stakeholders' capacities, especially governments, to act effectively and collectively towards their NDC roadmaps? I'm not sure if you're able to see it on your Q&A screen.
Yep.
Panelists, can I ask for any comments? Bill, maybe, sorry, come back to you. Bill, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Gossi. Okay, look, of course, misinformation is becoming a bigger problem for all of us. And I guess that's something that we need to learn to manage. And yes, it can cause problems for governments. It can cause problems not just for climate change, but for vaccine rollouts and so on. And we know that there's been some big messes here and there on vaccine hesitancy, for example, caused by misinformation. So yeah, that's a general issue that I think everyone needs to work on. For me, one of the bigger issues is, let's say to turn this around a bit, is the question of really how to learn from what we are doing on the ground. That can in some ways help to overcome misinformation by improving people's state of knowledge and understanding. So if we're talking about, implementing projects, it's really good to be able to have structural ways of learning from what worked and what importantly didn't work. It's very important to have an open system where people are encouraged to learn from what didn't work, and a safe place in government and project implementation where partners and participants can talk about the lessons of what worked and the lessons of what didn't work and what needs to be done better next time. Too often, I'm not sure what your experience is, but certainly our experience with many projects in different parts of the world and building in the Pacific is that monitoring and evaluation, you tick a box, right? But actually, it's much more important to think about how to learn through the system, through all your officials, all the people involved, to learn better how to go with it. So, and I think that's another way of trying to deal with another kind of misinformation is just continual learning and structuring that into all of the programs we've just been talking about.
Thank you, Bill. Tuti?
No, I don't have no major comments to add. I do agree with Dr. Harris' comments about misinformation. It is something that we need to deal with. It's a very general question in the context of not just climate change, but education, hospital, all the other items that Dr. Harris brought up. So I'm in full agreement, and that would be something we need to move forward with and address in the future as we continue with our individual projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuti. Francis? Comments?
Just very quickly, I do agree that there's a huge risk and that now there is a greater need for us to have robust communication, information, and knowledge management systems. And just this morning, we had a panel discussion on knowledge brokerage, which I think should play a key role in ensuring that we address this risk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, to our panelists. Sorry, panelists, there's one more general question. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in what is being said, so I hope you don't mind. One more general question, and then we will go to the specific ones. And the question is, how can monitoring and evaluation be improved for projects that are aimed at both capacity building for local communities and climate resilience? So Bill, sorry, start with you again.
Oh, thanks, Gossi. Yeah, look, I guess my previous comment about trying to build in learning and knowledge carrying capacity into monitoring and evaluation and all other kinds of projects really is important. And that means creating a specific space and place that's safe for all participants to discuss how to improve. I say safe because people receiving donors' resources don't always want to admit that something didn't work or didn't work as well, or milestones were not met. So I think, you know, in our view, that's a really important thing to really work on, and then to have institutional ways of learning and carrying that through regional bodies and government and increasingly the private sector actors in the region. I think that's really important to avoid the problem of every time you come across a particular situation, it feels like a new one. So just that learning and growing is really important to build up that capacity, I think.
Thank you, Bill. Tuti?
Thank you very much, Dr. Hare. Thank you, Director General. I'm just going to focus on just a bigger kind of question or statement, just to build off on Dr. Hare's comment. You know, a lot of the projects and work that we do on the islands in terms of capacity building might have also an issue with the number of people we have. Palau, for example, is a very small island. We have 20-some thousand people here. We cannot be doing everything all at the same time. You cannot be a project implementer, a monitoring, review, verification person. I think that's a bigger question that our leaders and us can also answer. How do we address these things? And I'm just falling back to the NDC hub and figuring out a way how to coordinate those things that we're limited in. My office specifically cannot be a regulatory authority and a climate change expert at the same time. We need to figure out a way how to address those issues. The bigger issue of population size and ability. Maybe we need to think about how to specialize in one or the other, and then connect with the South-South cooperation of Palau being a monetary review person helping Samoa, or just ideas right away for now. I'll leave it at that, and we can discuss it more later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tuti, for all those words of wisdom. Francis?
Again, just very quickly, based on my experience, monitoring and evaluation, of course, I would like to again stress the importance of knowledge management. This is very much a crucial aspect of that. And because of the lessons learned, that will be able to be documented as part of this. And highlight again the importance of knowledge progress, ensuring that the lessons learned that are coming through, are included as part of our research and are tailored into our capacity programs, just to address those gaps, whatever gaps that have been identified as part of the implementation of those projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you to the other panelists. So we'll just focus now on the more specific ones. There's a couple of them. There's a question specifically, I think, for you, Bill. The first question addressed to you, Bill, is the Dutch courts made a ruling 24 hours ago that Shell must reduce its emissions by 45% by 2030 from 2019 levels. I wonder what difference that contribution may have on the global goal. How will this court ruling be applied towards reporting mechanisms under the UNFCCC and the global stocktake?
Right, that's a very interesting question from Ewan, actually. The 45% by 2030 reduction is, of course, the global reductions we need to achieve to get on a 1.5 degree pathway, and I think that's where the court got it from. Shell is under criticism for not taking action on climate change seriously enough. It's under pressure from shareholders and courts, actually, not just in the Netherlands. So I think the bigger issue here is what this reflects is that an increasing level of legal pressure on some of the major corporate emitters, right? And I think that's going to be felt in the way that it feeds through to national action. If companies like Shell start to back off their fossil fuel developments and invest in renewables, then that will help to accelerate national action. And that's ultimately how it will be reflected through the UNFCCC process and in the global stocktake. I don't think that we'll see corporate emission reporting coming anytime soon into the climate convention process. There are a variety of other exercises, including the Carbon Disclosure Project, which tracks and monitors corporate emissions. And there is an increasing level of pressure from financial regulatory agencies at an international and national level on heavily carbon exposed companies like Shell to reduce that exposure and therefore reduce the risk of their companies suffering and creating systemic problems for the financial system globally. So I think that's might not be the what you expected from that answer, but I think this is a very, very interesting development, and we're seeing companies and increasingly countries under increasing legal pressure to face up to their responsibilities, and I think that's a very positive thing, actually.
Thank you very much, Bill. Tuti, any comments to offer?
No, Director General, I'm not very familiar with that particular comment. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So, Ewan, if you're listening, I hope that I thought that was a really good response from Bill. Bill, you got one more question. Okay, the question is, sea level rise will be devastating to coastal areas of all Pacific Island countries and may also pose substantial threats. The possibility exists for a worst case scenario in which climate change causes great or total loss of territory and migration from low-lying countries. Beyond adaptation and mitigation, are there national/international efforts underway to somehow preserve these states and their sovereignty in some form in the future? For example, maintaining their EEZs, and if so, what are they? If not, what should be done on that front? It's a loaded question. Bill, maybe you can have a...
This is obviously
Certainly the first speaker, you get to answer the question first, and then we'll hear from the others. But it is a loaded question, and perhaps maybe if you can just have a stab at it, and then we'll see how the others go.
Yeah, it's definitely having a stab at it, because there's no easy answer to these questions at all, actually, and we know that from discussions in Tuvalu and other places over the years. Look, it's absolutely correct that sea level rise is going to cause really serious problems, even at the 1.5 degree warming limit for many, if not all, Pacific Island countries. And I just reiterate again that if we can limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we should strictly limit the long-term sea level rise. To get a number in your head, every 5 years delay basically in reducing emissions to the level needed for the Paris Agreement locks in sea level rise equivalent to what's already happened over the last 250 years, right? So there's a long-term lock-in of inaction now. Now, we also know that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will probably avoid the tripping of a unstable loss of ice from Antarctica and Greenland, right? We also know that if we get to 2 degrees warming, that unstable loss of ice sheet mass with multi-meter sea level rise over centuries will become inevitable. So that puts pressure on 1.5 degrees. Now, what if the worst case happens, and it could even happen at 1.5 degrees for low-lying atoll countries? Then yes, there is a risk of existential loss of territory. Now, that's one reason why someone else asked, what are the priorities this year for Pacific Island countries? And I put, the top of my list was loss and damage. Really, that has to be ramped up in terms of governance and resources. And embedded in the loss and damage issue are many of the questions here for which there's no good or simple answer at present. I think the states that are most concerned about losing and loss of territory, the low-lying atoll countries, are already beginning to explore in the background their own legal options. And I think there does need to be, you know, a more thinking and a coordinated approach to protecting sovereignty, culture, livelihoods, and resilience over time in these countries that are very low-lying, whose existential loss could even happen at 1.5 degrees. I think that's quite urgent.
Thank you, Bill. Tuti, any comments to offer?
Just a quick comment, Director General. I just want to generally address this issue of sea level rise. I think we need to focus also with locally, how do we get our leaders in government as well as in our regional organizations to start pushing for focus on education, whether engineering or sciences, that helps us focus and address some of these issues locally. I don't have that background, so I can't really say what we can do in Palau to stop sea level rise. But I know that if we can invest in our youth and our future, maybe there'll be an answer later on in the future. Yep. So it's like I said, I cannot like Doctor here. It's a loaded question. I think that's the only thing I can add to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tuti. Francis is skipping this one, but as you said, Bill, I mean, it's a very difficult question, and there's no good or simple answer. I just wanted to, I guess I'm using my moderator's privilege here, and that is there are some regional initiatives that are looking at addressing this issue. There is, through the forum, working closely with the scientific and technical work that the SPC has done in terms of the work on maritime boundaries delimitation. There was an effort or an initiative to seek the legal advice of the International Law Commission for an opinion in terms of whether countries in the region could be able to maintain the baselines of their EEZs by having it recognized internationally and legally. As I understand it, the challenge that we face with that approach is that there isn't enough customary international law practice to be able to support that kind of approach that we here in the Pacific are attempting to do. It is an ongoing issue, work. As I mentioned, there isn't any legal precedent for this kind of these kinds of issues, and so we as a region are looking at all options. And so it's important for us as a region, therefore, to build up customary international practice in order to reinforce that particular point. In other words, we need, as individual states, but also collectively, build practice at the national level and at the regional level to substantiate or to reinforce our perspective that irrespective of what happens with sea level rise, that our base points in terms of our EEZs are recognized internationally and that they maintain irrespective of the impact of climate change. I hope I've explained that clearly, but that's the initiative that the forum has initiated, and of course, take into account the work that technical work that SPC has done in terms of maritime boundary delimitation. Okay, right. Are there any?
It's one more.
Okay. Okay, we got, I think maybe two more. We've got time, I'm told, for a couple more questions. There's another general question that's just popped up in the Q&A screen. And the question is, where and how can we best use the experience of the COVID-19 to date in the Pacific situation to align us to ongoing efforts, that is the decarbonization, especially taking it from a socio-economic, cultural perspective. Any takers?
I could start out, Kossi, because I can give a high level of generality if that's useful.
Yes, Bill, please go ahead.
Yeah, look, I think one thing that COVID has taught us, at least I'm interested to hear also whether my view is shared, is that it does show that we can work together. It does show people that if we stick together and work together, then we can deal with even really existential problems. And I think for many places, it's also reinvigorated people's belief in good government and good organization. And I think that's one of the things that we need to take away that's positive from the COVID crisis. And another issue I think that relates to the issues that come up earlier in this webinar are about issues of economic and energy security. Big hits on one sector, tourism, for example, have ramified throughout the Pacific in adverse ways. And I think we need to be looking in the COVID recovery to ways in which we can improve our economic and social resilience to external shocks, including climate change. And so, you know, by all means, and it's needed to reduce emissions to zero from the energy and sector, but it's also, as Tuti said, basically a economic issue as well, economic and energy security issue, and that improves economic resilience for economies. It also points to the need to consider how to diversify economic activity. So that's just a few general observations. I mean, small island countries around the world that we work with are really, really suffering from COVID. Really, it's a big mess. And I think at another level, I think the international community needs to be asked to step up to help. I think that's another agenda item for leaders in the Pacific to think about. I know in the Caribbean that leaders are already working on that. I presume that's the case in the Pacific as well.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Tuti, any views to offer?
I'll just go ahead and add the aspect of energy security and economic development. Because of this COVID issue within the northern part of the Pacific, specifically Palau, we're talking about how to move forward in the context of possible 100% fossil fuel free energy production, and at the same time create some sort of blue economy. An example that we're trying to look at right now specifically is green hydrogen. It's an idea that leads us to the pathway to 2050, but it is something that we can discuss and look at, because we see now that fisheries and tourism cannot be our only economic industries in the Pacific, well, specifically in Palau. So we need to diversify, as said earlier. So that's just an example I'd just like to share. It's in the research and feasibility study phase about infrastructures, because we still need to develop infrastructures within each island, and then transportation. And then because we're up north and to the west, we're closer to the Asian market. So there is a possibility that might work out again, but we're talking about 2050 or beyond 2030. So at least if we can get some individuals who are interested in studying these things, as an engineer and scientist, we can get that human capacity as well as the partnership between private and public in our island. So that's just one example I'd like to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuti. Francis?
Yes, just some very quick reflections on the topic. I think with the COVID-19, I think it has made us go back to the simple way of living, as well as looking at prioritizing or in terms of prioritizing nature-based solutions. Like now we are relying more and more on nature to provide for us, especially with the lockdown of our borders. And we find that, people are now having to go back to nature to supply for their needs. I think it is an opportune time also for us to look at putting more emphasis on community-based adaptation projects that will not only conserve the environment, but provide for the livelihood of our people.
Thank you, Francis, for that. We have one more question. Apologize for those who posted questions on the Q&A screen. What we will do is that we will spread and somehow we'll get the pen as well, but we will respond to those questions so that even if it's not responded to now, there will be an answer or a response that will be sent by email if that's possible. So please, we value every question. Just that we now have a time constraint on us. So we just have one more question to address and then we will sum up. We'll wrap up things. The last question is, what is your view in declaring climate emergency for our region? A very, very, I think, very important question. We've seen all kinds of emergencies being declared. Is it now time for us to have climate emergency? I think that's the essence of the question. So, Bill.
Okay, well, of course, this is a question that only you and each country can answer. I mean, it's fairly obvious that there is a climate emergency going on. So there are plenty of grounds to declare an emergency. If you have an emergency, then you need to do something about it, or someone else needs to do something about it. So I would suggest that considering if there's a climate emergency declared, that you have a series of really strong and clear and actionable demands on those that are most responsible for the climate emergency. Because you also need to, in declaring an emergency, give people hope and empower them that actually we can do something about this.
Thank you very much, Bill. Tuti?
Nope, I'm just in support of what Dr. Harris said. We need to engage our leaders and hopefully in their forum meetings and regional meetings, they can agree that it is a crisis, it is an emergency, that we can move forward from there. Thank you.
Francis, yes.
I'm not at liberty to state what the sort of position we should take, but what I can share is I think it's something that we need to look into in terms of the implications this will have on our small islands. But yeah, it's worth looking into. But yeah, I can't say. Thank you.
Well, again, as using my prerogative as the moderator, I was just talking to Tangaloa here. I do recall seeing something in the leaders communicate where the reference to a climate emergency phrase was used. And so I think it's a matter of socializing that that phrase, because as you said, Bill, we have the grounds. We have the grounds to actually declare, if that's the right way of saying it, we do have an emergency. If we're talking about existential threats, then surely that must be an emergency. So as I said, the leaders, I do recall in their discussions last year or the year before, I've seen that reference to climate emergency. But I think that needs to be socialized a bit more. And perhaps maybe some action needs to be taken to reinforce that. Well, listen, thank you so much to all the panelists. Appreciate your time, and I think we've learned a lot from your views and your comments. And I also like to thank those who posted questions on the Q&A post. As I said, if we've not been able to respond to your question during the panel, we will send an email, or one of us will be able to send a response. Hopefully that will address the question. But I'd like to wrap up our session now, and to the panelists, if there's one word that I want you to use one word to perhaps maybe describe one issue from your perspective that we could leave with the audience. And so what would be that one word? Bill?
Urgency. No time to waste.
All right. Thank you. Tuti?
Relationships, we need to develop them stronger.
Relationships. Francis?
Greater coordination. Thank you.
Thank you. Very wise words. Well, thank you once again to all of our panelists for joining us. Can I also, at this point, thank all of those who are joining us online, those who are joining here at Spread. Thank you for your time, and thank you for being part of this first webinar series by Spread. We appreciate very much your time, and we hope that this has been a useful platform for discussing some of the most important questions when it comes to climate change. So thank you very much once again. I'll pass it back to the MC for our session today. So, Vanda?
Thank you very much, Director General. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of our panel discussion. May I now call upon the Director of Climate Change Resilience Program here at Spread, Ms. Lokupa, for her closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanda, and I forgot to press the button. Thank you very, very much, Madam MC. It is my role now to bring the first webinar series for Spread, conducted by the Climate Change Resilience Program, to a close. And with that, to say a big telava and a big whawelahi to our panelists, our esteemed panelists, for taking your time to join us today to share and impart wisdom, but most especially to also acknowledge the time and the presence in the beginning of His Excellency, the President of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Your words resonated very well and was close to home for all of us in the room, as well as I'm sure over 200 participants who are on this live feed today on Zoom. And then there's another lot of participants who've joined us on the live feed in Facebook. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. And we are grateful to have both you, Tuti, as well as Dr. Bill, old friends who have joined us in your different time zones, and acknowledge also the presence in the room of Madam CEO for MNRE, Government of Samoa. And it would be remiss of me to miss acknowledging my Director General. Thank you very much to our moderator for his guidance and wisdom as well in taking us through this panel discussion. The participants, you were the most important people here today, other than the panelists and our keynote speaker, and I want to acknowledge your time and also acknowledge you for the questions that you have put to us. We thank you. The Secretariat will bring to you a series of these webinars, and through, I think, the next few months, Dr. General. The next one, I think, will be in June by another program. But for us now, this is the climate change one. This follows on from 2 days of webinars for the Climate Change Center. Your questions today, as well as the discussion and the points raised by the panelists, also have provided us in our program with some guidance and perhaps some strategic ways forward to engage better with our audience. So with that, I would like to bid you all farewell until the next webinar and thank my team. I would like to extend to my team in the room, the Climate Change Program. They're all here. A big thank you very much, and most especially to the team working on this. It's not just climate change, and as Ron and Brenda, it is our IT team and our communications team, and Nanette, who's online for the providers. So with that, I would like to then bring this session to a close. And hand back to the MC.
Thank you very much, Director Loa. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we say fare thee well, tofa sifoa, until next time. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Guys, have a good day.